And now I will hand it over to our speaker, Tanna.
Thanks so much, Blair. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining. Give us a shout in the chat if for any reason my audio doesn't sound good as we proceed today. And also, I just want to give everybody a heads up that you may hear some background noise. I am in a pretty active therapy space right now, so there'll be some authentic noises that are very in line with the topic that we are going to explore together. So hopefully that doesn't distract you too much and we can get through our exciting topics today. This is part two of a two-part course. I'm hopeful that some of you were able to join me for part one, and if not, you definitely can go back and watch that recording on the AbleNet website. We will be picking up with the more of the support end of things today, whereas before it was a lot of observation and kind of assessment around these connection concepts that are at the center of our topic. Just a reminder of who I am and how you can get in touch with me. Some of you also have already reached out via email to ask me some questions about some of the content from part one. I love that. If I didn't get back to you yet, it's just because it's been a hectic season. But I do get back to everybody who reaches out with any questions or comments or points of discussion. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I am speaking to you today as an SLP with some areas of interest and specialty in autism and of course AAC, which is why you're all here today. When I'm not an SLP, I am a consultant, a coach, and a trainer, and the founding director of Accessible. So you will see some of the resources from Accessible speckled into the talk today. Accessible is a nonprofit, so if you do see a resource that is not financially accessible to you and you would like to reach out to me for some support in acquiring that, please let me know. But most of the resources that I will share today will be entirely free. And if there's any low-cost ones and I can support you, I am happy to do that. You have these in your webinar outline, but I just want to remind us of some of the goals I'm hoping we can tackle today. First and foremost, I really want to help you narrow in on some of the intervention elements that you will be focusing on when working with children on the autism spectrum who are learning to use AAC to communicate. I also want to give you some prompts and cue guidance. Of course, there's no hard and fast, right or wrong. I can't give you a prescription necessarily on prompts and cues that you should or could use, but I definitely want to add to your toolbox and also talk about some of the prompts and cues that you might already be using and some of the pros and cons of some of those choices that you're making. And then I have a lot of resources to share with you as we go throughout the talk today. Some are AAC specific, some are more autism specific, or may be very transdisciplinary concepts that are not directly autism and AAC focused, but that I have found helpful through my career as I've tried to become a better clinician for these types of learners. We just had our brief intro, and the way we're going to flow is really to spend most of our time today talking about a framework that I co-created with my colleague Heidi Hosick, who works at Team Autism in Tennessee. Her and I are very enthusiastic followers of the DIR model and did a master class for them last year where we really tried to put a framework around this idea of how does AAC instruction look a little different for some of our children on the spectrum who are in those emerging stages of communication, but also in emerging stages of learning to regulate, to share attention and develop relationships with the people in their lives. So we're calling this the Mindful AAC Modeling Framework. It is a work in progress, but I think it'll be a helpful tool to bring into this conversation, along with some guidance and learning support strategies around those connection concepts that we tackled in part one. We're also going to do that resource exploration with time permitting. Otherwise, you do have a link in your PowerPoint to help you move through those resources at your own pace. But I'll mention them as they're relevant throughout the talk as well. And then hopefully we'll end with some question and answer time today. So then, getting started, this is a reminder slide from part one. We talked about these three connection concepts, the very first of which is regulation. And we defined regulation in the terms of AAC really as the learner's readiness to engage, to relate, and to learn in our interactions with them around AAC or just around other developmental skills that we're working on. And in part one, we discussed a lot of ways that we can collaborate with the learner in observation and interaction, but also with familiar partners to that child and also team members to help identify some of the regulation needs that could potentially be causing barriers to our attempts to engage and embed AAC into our sessions. So we're going to pick up with then, we've got these identified perhaps needs, and that's always a dynamic process, right? Because the needs are going to change, but also our understanding of those needs is going to change as we get to know these learners and as we see them in different contexts. But here are a few support strategies that I think are helpful general strategies to bring to this idea of supporting self-regulation. We talk a lot when working with children on the autism spectrum about helping them to regulate, needing to regulate. And self-regulation is something we all strive for. Last time we talked about what dysregulates us as adults, perhaps neurotypical adults or neurodiverse adults, wherever you fall on that continuum, but really knowing that all of us become dysregulated and that our goal is to self-regulate. However, young children with and without neurological differences really are not self-regulating so much as co-regulating in these early stages of life. And so strategies like encouraging the child to self-advocate for a beanbag or squeezes or tickles, those are great. Those are very left brain logic strategies. They rely on language and logic, and they're probably not going to be the frontline strategy for co-regulating with your children on the autism spectrum who are at this very young age and also this very young stage of their communication. So the very first thing that I always try in my clinical sessions is to make sure that I myself am regulated. In order to provide, these learners the co-regulation support that they need, we really do have to ensure that we are ourselves regulated. And we talked a little bit last time about what does it feel like for you to be dysregulated? That answer may be different depending on where you are in your workday, where you are in your work setting, where you are in your personal life, the level of stress, fatigue, physiological pain or discomfort or distraction that you're experiencing. But it really is an important part of our work with these communicators that we do a lot of introspection and reflection on what types of regulatory capacities we're bringing into every single session. I had a mentor early on in my career in Florida, wonderful, talented clinician. And one of the biggest takeaways that I got in my early years working with her is she had these little kind of dream catchers on the outside of the doors in her clinic rooms all throughout the clinic. And it was really kind of this idea of whatever baggage that we felt we were bringing into that moment, it was a good visual reminder to be aware of it. You can't pack it away all the time, but to be aware of it, tuck it away if you can, but also navigate through it in a reflective manner as you're working with children and families. So that's really part of the first steps of being regulated is really to be aware that you are a human in addition to being a clinician, and that you may be bringing some additional pieces of dysregulation to a session that are really not in your control, but can be in your awareness. And you can figure out how they may be contributing in a positive or a hindering way to the interactions with the children that you're serving. Sometimes in addition to awareness, we do have to realize, even in a session where we went in with a regulated state of mind, but perhaps interactions with a particular child are dysregulating for you. Maybe you feel that you're not being productive in a session, or you're doing a lot of managing of challenges and you're feeling a little confused or chaotic, and it can be quite dysregulating. So I always try myself when I'm in situations with students, especially that I'm just getting to know, to try to do some co-treatment if I can, do some co-treatment with families, but also with other clinicians and educators, so that if I get into a space where I am dysregulated, I can remove myself from that interaction as I need to. Maybe that's just removing myself from interacting directly with the child so that I can collect and reflect on the situation and come back in with more awareness and knowledge, or I may actually need to leave the session. And that's not always possible. And of course, we have to ensure that children are always safe and with adults and with skilled providers. But I just want to make sure that you're all thinking about the fact that this is an important element where collaboration and teaming could really come in handy, whether that be with parents or team members that are on your clinical team. All right, so in addition to being regulated ourselves, there are some ways that we can try to help our learners co-regulate. Um, Co-regulating really means that through the use of our right brain, through the use of our affect and our biophysiological movements and the intensity of our movements and our voice and all of these elements of emotion that we bring it to life, through using those, we can actually help our learners to tune in with us, or we can tune in with them when they need us to attune to their needs and to help them regulate their emotions either up or down. So some of the ways I like to use this co-regulatory idea is by thinking about some basic ways that I can change either myself, my presence, or elements of the environment in a way that serves to help regulate that learner. So for example, my presence. Uh, if I am too close to someone who needs a little bit more space, a learner that gets anxious when I'm in close proximity for whatever reason, then maybe I need to move further away. Or if I've got a down-regulated learner who's a little under-responsive and may have a little bit of a hard time understanding what the expectations of an activity are. If I'm too far away, do I need to move in a little bit closer? So sometimes the proximity of my body in the space can be a service of co-regulation. This is also true of the presence of others. Some of our young children are particularly activated by the presence of certain people in the environment. Those may be peers or members of the clinical team, and we don't know why. Perhaps this is an activating relationship, but for whatever reason, there may be certain people that are dysregulating to children. And so, do we need to remove ourselves as the clinician and child from a particular environment because there's a person, maybe another peer at a daycare center, for example, that dysregulates our child because they're noisy or they move too quickly or they try to take their toys, right? So the presence of yourself and the presence of others is definitely a first element to consider. In addition to proximity, I also want to make sure that I am operating in a space that really helps my learner stay regulated and engaged. I'm always thinking of engagement beyond regulation. And so sometimes I find that getting below my learner's eye level, at their eye level or below their eye level, that does not mean that they need to make eye contact with me. That's not the point. But it means that I am getting into a space that really reduces complexity, right? Because as I'll demonstrate here, as I get close to you, right, the background is disappearing from me. And so some of our learners on the spectrum have some visual processing differences where the learning space can be quite complex, even if they don't have vision issues. And so sometimes getting close and getting down or below that child's eye level can be a regulating and engaging posture. Mm, mm. The second piece I like to think about in modifying myself is how can I use my non-linguistic ways of communicating and ways of being with children to add to regulation for this child. So I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but I have had children who are really sensitive to the way I use my voice. I'm going to pop over to the chat just to give us a brain break and an active learning moment here. But has anybody experienced a moment with their learner where their voice, the tone of their voice, the volume, prosody, the rhythm, has resulted in dysregulation or regulation? Maybe you could pop a couple lines in the chat and share your experience. Lots of singing and they'll cover their ears. I've been hit in the face for singing before. Yeah, you too. Yeah, yeah. So lots of ideas, guys, in the chat. Scoop those up because my guess is they're all very intuitive ways that you, either as a clinician or as a human, have discovered, hey, I can use this amazing emotional tool, right? The emotion and meaning of what we say is really tied in to the way that we say it. And the way we use our voice, the rhythm of our speech, the pace of our speech, all of that matters. But here we're talking specifically about the voice. So this may not be with any words. This is really just the tone, the rhythm, the melody of our voice. I'm sure that you all have noticed that when you use a high prosody, a high melodic tone, it tends to be quite engaging and upregulating, right? So if I'm singing five little monkeys jumping on the bed, you can hear that my vocal intonation is going up pretty much at every stanza of that song. However, if I use lower tones, not just lower volume, but lower tones, we know that those are quite down regulating for children. So if you think about the way that a parent might soothe a young baby, these are similar concepts, right? Where we're using the properties of our voice to upregulate or downregulate. And then we're always stepping back and observing, how did my change in vocal tone, vocal rhythm, prosody, vitality, all of those intensities that go along with voice, how did that serve to change the regulation status of this child, right? So we're not going to use it just because, I said that down tone is going to help the child down regulate. You're going to use the trial and error method and see how it's working. There's also other ways that we use affect or emotion to help kids co-regulate that are not related to our voice. So, for example, how might you use your body to engage a child who is under responsive, someone who is dysregulated, but in a way where they're under responsive? Pop some ideas in the chat. Yeah, we've got some interesting ideas here. So I'm thinking here, you guys are using your body, absolutely, and you're using it with the child. So we're thinking here sensory input. But I was thinking more about how would you move your body, right? So if you wanted to upregulate a child who may be a little bit low energy, you might use higher vitality movements, right? This is where you might jump that dinosaur really, 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 really fast. And maybe you make sound or maybe you don't make sound. You're exploring with kind of, do I use multiple senses or just do I use one here? But modulating the rhythm and the speed of movement in our play or our gross motor activities with these kids can also be a way of exploring co-regulation. In contrast, if the child is overexcited, maybe even in a positive way, you can see they're getting a little overstimulated, I might shift my gears down, right? We're thinking of it just like a gear of a car. I don't drive, but I hear it in the car when I'm in it, right? As that car is reaching a hill and having to, go up a steep incline, the different gears are going to downshift and upshift accordingly, right? And so we're kind of looking at that regulation meter and trying our best to understand, do we need a little upregulation here, or do we get a little too excited, and was I a contributing factor to that? How can I use that tone and that movement in order to bring that regulation level down? Mm. There's also some other ways, of course, to use facial expressions and gesture. There's a lot of evidence in the research that shows that when we use high affect in our, it was taught to me early on in my career as therapeutic use of self, right? So if I want to become animated in order to get a child engaged and upregulated, I'm going to use a lot of big facial expressions and hand movements. I'm going to emphasize and stretch out my speech, right? But if I want to downregulate, I'm likely going to have a flatter affect. I may mirror that child's affect if they're upset. And so I'm trying to kind of match their regulation, and if they need a little support, to bring them back to green. If we're thinking of green as that just right regulatory level for what we're doing together. Doesn't always mean they need to be calm. And we talked a little bit about that last week. And I mentioned that the Autism Level Up group just released a book that I'm super excited to get and read. Talks a lot about this idea of regulation is not always calm. It is the right energy. The right energy, right is not even the right word, right? It's the most effective energy and state to bring to a particular task or interaction. All right. So lastly, we can talk about environmental changes as well. Some of our kids get dysregulated when they have spaces that are challenging to their senses, right? So we've already talked about how spaces can be noisy. I've also had kids who, I don't know if you guys have ever experienced this, they walk into a room with no toys, and it's very dysregulating for them. I have other kids who walk into a room with a lot of toys, and that is very dysregulating to them. So, as you think about the way that you observe children interacting with the spaces that you're in, to some reasonable degree, think about how that space might be adjusted in order to help that child regulate. Of course, knowing we can't control all spaces, especially if we're working in the home or in early childcare settings. The name of the book is Energy, by the way, Amy. It's called Energy, and it's by the Autism Level Up uh, folks. And I actually linked it in your resources for today as well. All right, I've been on this slide too long, so I'm going to move on. I think you guys are getting the hang of it and also just um, putting some wonderful ideas in the chat already. One last piece before we move on from this slide, though, is I really want to, because we're speech and language therapists, most of us in this room, or at least focused on building language in this webinar together, as the title um, gives us clues to. I talk too much, as you can tell. I don't know how many of you talk a lot. We want to talk to our kids because we know that we want to teach them language, but language can also be quite dysregulating to children. And so one of the elements that I like to manipulate in that meter as I'm co-regulating is also the amount of talking I do, how frequent I'm talking before I leave a quiet space or a quiet pause. I also want to choose the words that I use to match what is going on in that learner's emotional experience. So I don't tell children how to feel or how they do feel. I don't usually tell them that. But I do want to use language and tone when it's appropriate that match that learner's emotional experience as much as possible. And so I may use a lot of wondering language instead of saying, you feel mad, right? I might say, oh, it looks like you're upset. I see. That was hard. Right. So I'm using a tone of voice and I'm using language that kind of narrates that experience. Um, Doing as best as I can not to label that emotion for that learner in a way that makes me seem like a better mind reader than I am. All right, let's move on then. So what does AAC look like here? If we've got a child who is working on um, regulating themselves in the moment or as a stage, right? Learning to regulate can be a place where some children spend a lot of time if they're in that earlier social emotional developmental stage. Other learners may be quite able to start showing some self-regulation, but in certain situations, they do need more of this earlier level support. So what does AAC look like here for a learner who is dysregulated? The very first thing we want to think about, of course, what we just discussed in that support slide is our connection focus. And really that is to help that learner regulate their body and mind. And through that regulation, what we hope will come from that is to establish some shared attention together, some shared engagement together. So learners at this stage, once they become regulated, may benefit in a session from using a lot more of those sensory and social routines rather than object-based play. Um, and the sensory and social routines can also be a wonderful tool to re-regulate if we become dysregulated. So then within some of those sensory and social routines that you might create as a learning context for AAC, our communication focus may not actually be on modeling AAC when we are dysregulated, right? If the child is in a dysregulated moment, whether they are dysregulated in an up fashion or a down fashion, modeling on my AAC device is likely not going to be happening very often, perhaps not even at all. But that doesn't mean I can't model anything. And so these learners I really find benefit a lot from me modeling some signals during these moments of co-regulation. And I like to think about signals as anything that communicates that's not a symbol. So any behavior, any gesture, movement, use of gaze, use of voice, I consider all of those signals. And likely they are the dominant way that a learner at this stage may be communicating on their own. So I can model some signals that are related to this co-regulation. For example, I have several kids who really love to sit with me and rock back and forth in a firm hug on my lap when they were feeling dysregulated. So this movement that I'm doing actually becomes a signal for that to happen with them. And so the other day, actually, I had a little guy who's been having a hard time transitioning out of the session. And after enough times of us sitting together and regulating, he actually came and sat on my lap and started moving himself like this. And I saw that as, a way for him to start that self-advocacy process of, this is how I can tell you what I want you to do with me to help me regulate, right? I can come and sit in your lap and I can move my body to show you what I need in order to help me calm down. In this case, it was calming down was what he wanted or needed to do. He was quite upset. So modeling signals is definitely at the top of my list in terms of a communication focus. And these can be any signals that are safe, but they don't necessarily need to be signals that fit into a box. This is not where we need to say, well, this is where I'm going to help you learn how to point or learn how to use a sign, which is actually not a signal, it's a symbol, but it can serve kind of more of a means and um, purpose for learners at this early stage. Any questions or comments about this idea of when a learner is dysregulated, AC devices and tools are probably not being used to model in those moments. That doesn't mean that they're not available for that regulated moment that's coming next, though, right? So this is not a readiness concept. This is not no one who's ever dysregulated should ever have an AAC device. That's not the conversation we're having, but it's thinking about that mindful modeling. Is this a good moment for me to pull out the AAC models, or is my connection focus my priority for this moment? And our sessions can change from moment to moment, or we can have entire sessions that we stay in this space, and it's really a rhythm and a synchrony that we're trying to achieve with that child in order to make those decisions together. Okay, so then let's just catch up on my slides here. Let me make sure I hit everything. Great. Okay. So then moving on, then we've talked a lot about regulation. Let's move to engagement now. And reminder from last class, we talked about engagement really being, um, you know, whoops, I lost my notes. Hold on one second. There we go. Getting back in there. Okay. So when a learner's engaged, we know that that's really where they are interested to interact with people and activities, right? So this learner is regulated. They're not having to manage their readiness and energy that they're bringing to learning experience. And also they're engaged. But what happens if they're not engaged? And I'm tempted, just as a reminder, to come back to all you in the chat and ask, what are some of the ways that your learners are showing you that they are not engaged? And I'm going to catch this question as you think about it. Having the regulator for use and yes. So somebody asked a question, are you saying that we should focus on helping a child get regulated? Yes, I am saying that. So even children who have AAC devices, and I believe that many, if not most of our children at this level should have some tools available to them. But if I'm dysregulated, I am not using the language side of my brain. I am using the right hemisphere mostly. I'm using the affect side of my brain, and I really need to connect with bottom-up strategies for regulation. So if anybody's ever read Beyond Behaviors or any of the work of Dr. Mona Delahook, she's also a book that I included in your resources. She's a huge advocate of really looking at behavior and regulation in this manner, and there are many that follow her in this line of thought as well. Oftentimes when children are dysregulated or even neurotypical children are upset emotionally, we tend to go in a little too prematurely with language, right? We want to talk to them about their feelings. We want to help them label their feelings. But really what they need developmentally, what neuroscience and early childhood research tells us, is they need us to connect with them with our right brains first, right brain to right brain. They really need those bottom up or body up ways of regulating before they can even receive language. And so if I have children who have a little bit more of those splinter skills where they're using their AAC quite a bit when they're regulated, but of course not engaging as much when they're dysregulated. I may make a decision, as an example to your question, where we regulate together without the AAC being a part of that process, but then we may come back and we may talk about the experience. Right? It looks like you feel better. Maybe I'm modeling as I'm touching here. We went and got squeezes. And so I may use that before, during, and after AAC modeling idea, where I maybe can't model in the moment while we're co-regulating, but that learner is using a lot more language to coordinate and integrate their life experience at their stage. And so I don't want to miss an opportunity to name and narrate some of the experience that we just had together, whether it was positive or it was challenging. Running around the room is a disengagement signal that we've got here. Two people are sharing running around the room. Task avoidance, not looking toward, pushing away toys. Yeah, so it sounds like you all have clear signals that you're getting from your learners as far as disengagement, and that was part of what we talked about in our part one of the series. So what do we do? What can we do in order to support engagement is kind of where we want to go next. So I want to slide over there. So you can see here, there's a lot of the same strategies here that we use when we're thinking about regulation. But the purpose of these strategies are very different when we're thinking about engagement. The very first purpose here at the top, or the very first strategy here at the top, of course, is we need to be engaging. And I'm sure all of you are rock stars at this based on the way that you responded to my question about using tone. But children need us to be engaging, especially if they are a little on the under-responsive side, right? So kids who really need big bells and whistles in order to pull out the salient features of an interaction and in order to find them joyful and motivating, right? So a big piece of engagement is really adapting ourselves as clinicians and as partners to become the most engaging, or at least the engaging. We're upping the ante of joy and motivation for the child based on what they're doing. And so some of our engagement strategies as far as using affect is, of course, to be playful, silly, and really engaging with the way that we use our bodies, use our facial expressions, and use our materials. I don't know if anybody in the room has used any Hanen trainings or Hanen materials in their career, but Hanen has some wonderful, really low-cost resources and free things on their website that talk about this idea of people play. And people play really is just that extension of the concept I mentioned before of those social and sensory routines. This is where we may have a child who has a difficult time at this current stage really managing an activity and a person, right? So that triadic gaze that becomes kind of a quadratic gaze, if you think about it, because we've got this AAC device going on now, can really be something that they're working on, but isn't quite as solid. And so really eliminating the toys or reducing toys and objects and focusing on some sensory social routines that involve movement and sensory experiences and music, maybe with a few objects, can be a great way to engage a child who may be disengaging from you by walking away, pushing away, or doing some of the things that you're talking about. I also think here, being flexible during these moments is really important for you and also for the child, right? So backing down, of course, on directions, rules, or conventions around a particular toy or an activity can be very helpful. And I don't know how many of you need this reminder, but I know I work a lot with families, and every parent or caregiver brings a different play experience to the table. And usually it's the way that they were played with or not played with that they're kind of pulling on as background, right? And so these can be helpful reminders to families who get a little stuck with the way that a toy should be used, right? So if we've got a kitchen toy, we've got to use it to cook and to feed, and that's how we use that toy. That can be great for moving play skills forward when those skills are the next best level, but it isn't usually very engaging for a child who's at a lower play level. And some families can feel quite stuck on what to do with materials or even how to insert themselves in that back and forth with an object or without an object, because perhaps they haven't had play examples that have been quite as flexible and quite as centered on the relationship and the interaction. I see some questions popping up about regulation. I'll make sure we leave some time to talk more about that. All right. We also want to be a partner with our kids who are engaging with us. And that means sharing control. It means sharing creativity, right? It might mean that the next session you have, instead of putting everything in a locked cabinet and requiring the child to request, as an extreme example, you've got a couple things laid out in particular areas of your clinic room. Or you encourage the family to set up the living room prior to your home visit, where you've got maybe 3 or 4 activities out in the carpet. And those activities then can serve as an inspiration, but also a way for that child to have agency and to guide you to what they're finding interesting for that moment. This also means this partnership that, instead of redirecting our activity and play in a way that fulfills our communication agenda, right? Going in as a speech therapist with an agenda on working on a particular core word, for example, that we want to partner with that child in really helping them achieve their intentions and their goals, right? So it's really this difference of going in with AAC in mind versus going in with connection in mind. I can embed my AAC in pretty much anything once I get a good hook going, right? But I really need that child to show me through partnership what do they want to achieve. How do they want to play with this toy? How do they want to experience the sensory properties of this toy? And then through that co-creation of the activity, I'm going to know where to take my language. Today, this morning, I had a session that was a really good example of this. I had a little one, I think it's about 3, and his partner was asking me how to engage him in more functional play. And this little guy is really a lot more anchored right now in those sensory social routines, those people play routines. Those are really the best way to get more interaction and connection going. But the first thing that we wanted to do is we wanted to just kind of take a look at, well, how does he like to play with those toys right now? What are the things and the sensory properties about those toys that he finds most engaging? And through observing that, we were able to come up with some ways to make those a little bit and a lot more interactive, really without changing his goal. His goal was to experience that sensory property. We just wanted to make that an interactive experience that we could do together without taking away from the joyful elements of it. Lastly, we can definitely use temptation to engage kids, but we want to use temptation in socially honest ways and also pretty carefully. When we create a lot of barriers in play, locking things away in containers, what have you guys noticed? What usually happens when there's a lot of obstruction in our use of communication temptations? Loving some of the comments in here. Follow a child's lead, they shut down, they get frustrated, they have tantrums. Absolutely, absolutely. Now, does this mean we have to have everything be a free for all and we can never create obstructions or barriers or temptations? Absolutely not. But if your child is not engaged, the very last thing that's going to get them engaged is for you to put a bunch of barriers and blockers up. So you do need to be mindful of where to put such temptations. So I think one of the best examples that I have in using some of these sensory social or people routines, is say I'm swinging a child and we're creating a nice rhythm, a nice ritual, as Hannah would say, that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Then I might actually pause that child at the top of the swing, right? And pause for maybe 2 seconds and wait and see what happens, right? That's a little bit of a communication temptation to get that child engaged with me to keep the swing going. But it doesn't mean that they have to say anything at this stage. What I really want to just see is, do they show some anticipation signals? And can I capture some moments where I can rope them in and woo them into an interaction by creating a couple temptations here and there in our routine together? Lots of frustration, self-absorption. Someone's called it here self-stim mode, but I really think of that as a child who's kind of gone within and is self-absorbed, and really has shut down because of the barrier that was placed being too much for them. And not because you intended it to be, but just because that was where it landed for them. We can also use our language, right, to tempt. I think that one of the biggest aha moments I've had at this stage where I'm really working to engage my kids is that when I use the right words, the words that seem to match their signals, what they may be thinking or feeling, as far as I can best guess with my very minimal mind reading abilities, they actually engage with me more frequently. I don't know if any of you have noticed this. There's a lot of research on this idea too. This concept of follow-in comments is very powerful in the literature for children using all types of modalities of language, including AAC. But when we can contingently model what that child seems to be focused on and what they seem to be communicating, what we end up seeing is a lot more engagement. Yeah, you guys have a lot of great ideas popping up in the chat here on how to create some of these gentle temptations as well. All right, and then lastly, sometimes engagement is hindered by the fact that the environment is not accessible for the child. So don't forget to think about universal design principles. You use your team members that have areas of expertise in motor, vision, and so forth that can really help you paint a full picture. Another good example from my session this morning, this little guy has significant motor planning differences. And I think that that is largely contributing to his repetitive play. He finds something he can do. He finds joy in that, and then he wants to do it over and over again. And who wouldn't, right? I want to do that too. And so being able to provide something as simple as a smaller ball he could hold on to better in this little activity we were doing actually led to differences in his play that I hadn't seen before. Because when he was trying to manage those larger balls, they weren't able to really do anything that he wanted them to do. And I think that that was probably mostly related to his fine motor differences. So coordinate with your team and see how can universal design and adapting the play and the learning environment really help to fulfill some of those engagement goals that you have for your student. So what then does AAC look like here? AAC is really going to look like connecting first and foremost. We always want to keep our connection going. And so our connection focus is going to be continuing to keep that child engaged, but also re-engaging that child when they become disengaged, right? When I establish engagement, I want to look for signs of engagement. And I feel like our last slide, our last part one, had a lot of ideas on how to look for some of the signs of engagement. I also included a checklist, I believe, around regulation that might be helpful here. We know that our idea here in connection is if I can help this child stay regulated and engaged more and more and more with me, that I'm building a relationship with them. They're seeing me as a trusted partner that's going to help them achieve a state where they feel safe and they feel ready to participate. And I'm going to do that enough that they know they can rely on me for that and expect that from me. And so then that engagement is going to hopefully continue, that relationship is going to hopefully strengthen, and that regulation may be a little bit less over time, or dysregulation rather. But at this stage, really, when a child is regulated and engaged, I want to continue to use some of those signals that we talked about, right? I want to model non-linguistic ways of communicating all of the time. But I may actually do a lot of contingent modeling here too. And that's what I described earlier, where I'm looking in those follow-in directions, where I can see what is this learner doing? What are they focused on? What do they seem to be thinking and feeling about what they're doing? And how can I match models to that? And then if they're communicating with me using their signals or their words, I want to match models to that as well. And so that's really what contingent models are. They're models on the AAC system that match what that learner is communicating to you. They can also be models that match what that learner is focused on. So some of those follow-in comments that we talked about. All right, and then relatedness, we talked before, and I just talked now about how that formula for relatedness comes from that consistent support and co-regulation and engagement. And this is really the sweet spot that we're looking for. We're hoping that we can get our AAC learners engaged and regulated and communicating with us in their way, so that we have a solid platform upon which to build language. And this is really what development tells us too. Most children in early developmental stages where they're learning to regulate and engage, even children who are neurotypical, are not using language at that time. And that is, there's a good reason for that. So we're looking for this sweet spot. And really, this is where our AAC snapshot is going to take a big shift because we're continuing to focus on connection. We know that we can move in and out of regulation and in and out of engagement because that is often the nature of how children on the spectrum are navigating their individual differences, right? So we want to continue to monitor and support any of those needs. We're going to continue to strengthen our relationship by doing that. But we're also going to move up with a lot more modeling. And so in that mindful modeling continuum, which I'm going to show you here in a moment, we might not only do some contingent modeling, but we might start doing a lot more focused stimulation here too, which is using our AAC system to model more often in that parallel talk or self-talk format. Again, trying to match it to the child's interests because we know that follow-in comments are a lot stickier in terms of their long-term learning impact than directives, questions, and other forms of adult language that we might be able to provide that child. This is also where we're probably going to start using more prompts and cues because we're going to start finding that as a child stays engaged and regulated, and we're able to provide more modeling, we want to have some opportunities for that child to also use the new words that they're learning. So I provided 2 slides here for prompts and cues. Very similar to what we use in the traditional speech and language space, which with a couple differences, of course. This is the resource from Kate Ahern that's recently been updated that's got a really nice way of thinking about a least to most hierarchy when using AAC with children. But I want to jump a little bit because we're running low on time, as I usually do for this talk, and just kind of get a sense from you. What do you think the benefits are of a least to most prompting hierarchy when you're thinking about working with these learners and teaching them how to use AAC? And it's follow in comments. That's follow in. And if you search that in Google Scholar, you should probably get some results that pop up. If you don't get any results, I would suggest searching parental verbal responsiveness or PVR, parental verbal responsiveness. And that is often the research studies that will talk a lot about those follow-in comments. Yeah. So what are you thinking the benefits of the least most hierarchy are? Because often when we teach a new skill, we think about a most to least hierarchy, meeting them where they are, avoiding them. Yeah, you guys got it. I don't need to beat this into the ground. So yeah, and I think it becomes a little tricky because when we're working with AAC, we're always providing modeling. Just like when we're playing with a child who's not working with AAC, we're always talking to them, right? So our AAC modeling, although considered kind of a most supportive cue, if we're using it as a cue, is actually both cue and also just part of the interaction, right? So I like to think about my modeling being me taking my turn and interacting naturally with the child, but also I use direct models in my prompt and cue hierarchy. Most of the evidence in the field right now will tell us that a least to most hierarchy is what we should be using when it comes to AAC instruction. And so I provided 2 examples of that for you in the slides. The first one from Kate Ahern on the prior slide, and this one is a little bit more descriptive about what some of these may look like in use. I didn't have a lot of time today to talk as much about prompts and cues as I wanted to. So if you have questions, please reach out to me. I do have some ideas on how to add to this prompt and cue hierarchy for kids who are specifically working a little bit harder on joint attention to models. For example, using things like pen lights and laser pointers, modifying the way that I model, even using physical emphasizing elements, which you might see a lot on Instagram to draw attention to words. But before we part ways today, I just wanted to get a sense of where we stand in the room on hand over hand. If you're using it, why? If you're not using it, why not? And what's the consensus? We talked a little bit about this last time. hand over hand. We've got some hand under hand. No, no, no. Lots of no, lots of no. So it looks like the consensus is no or never. And I would agree that is really where the research and clinical practice and neuroaffirming activism is telling us we need to go. So if you can remove this from your repertoire, I think you'd be moving in the right direction. There's obviously positives to helping students with physical support. We know that physical prompting can be a big part of lots of different teaching and therapeutic goals that we have. However, there's actually been really strong clinical and research evidence that shows that hand over hand actually is not as supportive as other strategies, and it can lead to many of the problems that you talked about in the chat just now, mainly prompt dependency and learned helplessness. So we're all going to hopefully be on a consensus that hand over hand is not a thing we're going to do. But if you want to challenge me on that and talk about it, I love to, because I learned so much about that, about things from those conversations. So reach out to me and email me, and we can talk a little bit more about your hesitations. I did see some of you mention hand under hand. There are some people who actually hate this too. There's some very vocal activism in the AAC world that hand under hand is never, 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 never okay. And I'm just going to put my personal opinion. I don't agree with that. And I think that it definitely depends on the student and the purpose behind the physical direction. For example, I only use hand underhand when I know that I have a student who has motor sequencing and motor planning challenges, who has some fine motor instability. And I only use hand underhand after that student has initiated reaching for their AAC tool. I will never take a student's hand and reach toward their AAC tool. Part of the reason I don't do that, other than I think it's intrusive probably and not welcomed by some children, is that I can't really control whether or not what I'm matching and teaching that learner is actually mapping their mind in the way that I hope it is, because they didn't actually initiate anything, right? So I'm really banking on the fact that when I said, we're going to go, and then I took their hand, that they're actually modeling or mapping rather the concept of go with me, giving them that hand or hand support. So some of that mapping is not going to stick when we don't allow the student to initiate. Also, communication starts with the student. The circle of communication is initiated by the child, no matter what type of modeling we're doing. So I'm not going to change that just because I'm using hand under hand support. I also want to make sure that I'm giving support in a way that's not guiding the student, but just supporting them and reaching for what they want to say, right? So I'm always going to wait for them to initiate. Can you read research citations on hand over hand? Yes, absolutely. So in your resources, I provided I want to say I provided both. I provided you a link to a blog post on practical AAC that talks about hand over hand versus hand under hand. The really wonderful thing that you'll get on that blog post is the argument that happens in the comments, which is also so informative, right? And the pros and the cons and the people who are hating it and the people who are loving it. And then in there, Dr. Zangari also cites a really great article by Jane Farrell that I think I put separately as well. There's a good starting point. It's definitely not a body of research, that one article, but it should give you some initial ideas, and also then hopefully can open you up to some terms that you can look for as you research more. So with that, I didn't leave us as much time for resource exploration as I wanted to, but I just want to pop over there quickly and make sure that you all know where the resources are, what they look like, and I add new ones to this curated collection as I find them. So if you come back to this link in a couple weeks, it wouldn't be uncommon for you to see new things there. I also encourage you to ask, to share with me anything I'm missing, any resources that you've encountered that you're like, you should really have this on there because this was really helpful to me. I definitely would love for you to share that with me. So in your PowerPoint, you'll have a link to this on the resource exploration section. And each one of these is just a resource that I have found super helpful as I've tried to wrap my mind around regulation, engagement, and really finding activities that I can use as a scaffolding for building AAC into my work with these children. So the one I was talking about just now with the prompting is in here. This is Autism Level Up. That's the folks I was talking about that have the new book and also tons of other resources. There's a link here to Mona Delahook's website where she's got a book and tons of trainings and resources she does. This is the hand under hand, hand over hand post, and also some Hannon links here for the people play and other sorts of activities. I think one of the things I've noticed most in working with these very young children early in their journey with autism is that I really need to find more ways to have fun with them. And so I put a lot of resources in there that hopefully will just inspire you to think about engaging these children in different ways, perhaps building on some of the things that you already do together. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to questions. Blair, I'm also happy to stay on a couple minutes extra for questions if the group would like. Did go a little over what I had promised.
That sounds great. We've had one question put in the Q&A about, it says recommendations for a single mother household who is unavailable physically or emotionally to help the learner co-regulate due to their own dysregulation. How do you move the learner to self-regulate or co-regulate in a different way?
Absolutely. So this is beyond my, if I'm pretending to be you, this is a situation that's beyond my scope of competence because I'm not a mental health counselor. So I put on my resource coordination hat at this moment. I offer myself as a reflective, active, compassionate listener to that mom if she has a relationship with me and feels that she can share some of her experience in our sessions. But really, it sounds like before this woman can be an asset to her child in this way, she needs somebody to help her regulate. And that means she may need sources beyond your ability. If anybody else has ideas on how they've navigated this situation, please share. Um, but I think that the family unit is your client at the moment, and I think you need other resources and people on your team to help that family unit move forward. Any other questions?
Looks like we had another one asking if you have any experience working with deaf students with autism.
Very minimal, actually. Um, we did, however, have a wonderful speaker who joined us in our early intervention conference. We do one every year at Accessible in February. Her name was Susie DePillo, I want to say. And she is an AAC enthusiastic SLP who works with deaf and hard of hearing students. If you would like, I can connect you. Perhaps if you've got questions, she might be a great resource or she may know somebody who is.
Perfect. We have another one who asked, so I have a child who's very proficient at his AAC device, but he often stims on particular buttons and it can be very distracting. She said, how do we disrupt this?
Mm-hmm. Um, so STEM is an interesting thing because it is very difficult to know the purpose behind that child pushing that button. And I'll give you one thing to chew on that might help your thought exercise as you try to problem solve this. There's some research coming out, lots of it actually recently coming out, that's really showing us the functions of Gestalt processing for our learners. And I have noticed that these concept of Gestalt language are not only for learners who are using spoken words. I'm seeing this in learners who are using aided words as well. I'm even seeing this in learners who are using media to communicate, so communicating through YouTube videos and songs. And so before I jump to STEM, not discounting that it's probably very distracting to somebody, it's probably not distracting to the child, but it's probably distracting to somebody. I think you may start best with reflecting on some of the other functions of that behavior that may not only or even at all be STEM in nature. So I think that one of the ways to do that is to get some history on when that particular button or word or phrase is being used in other contexts. And I wonder if you can put some pieces together that would help you respond in a way that would help that learner take the conversation in the direction that they want to go, whether it's to request or to share something, or to indicate they need regulatory support. So you need to get to the underlying purpose, and I don't know that it's only or even at all STEM, before you can start to reduce or eliminate that behavior.
Great. I think we could take maybe one or two more. Someone asked, what are your thoughts about our role in providing information slash recommendations for parents to explore medications? I have many middle schoolers on my caseload who have moderate to severe behaviors or an inability to focus and are unmedicated.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't take it on myself to provide medication recommendations because it's just not in my scope of competence or practice. I've also heard from many of my psychiatry and psychology colleagues that medications are often not the only or even the best strategy for many of the behavior and attentional challenges that you're talking about. So I think the very first thing that I might want to do is, if the family agrees, you might want to connect to whatever behavior and psychology or psychiatry or medical team member is managing that child's care. Have some conversations and dialogues with them. um, I think that to suggest medication would be too prescriptive without having all of the information. And so, if I have concerns that this child could be doing better with other types of biological support, I want to go to somebody on the team who's had a little bit more of that lens on and sort of dialogue with them before approaching the family.
Okay, let's see. We've got one more that says, do you have any recommendations for how to help a group of children transition out of a group session when they are overstimulated, similar to how you rock with your one child?
That's a tough situation. Yeah. Interesting. Well, I have learned some really brilliant strategies as an observer in this situation. So, just letting you know, I have not run a full group session with young children on the autism spectrum. Most of my sessions are dyads or individual sessions, but I have worked with daycare providers that are kind of rock stars in doing this. And I think one of the biggest takeaways I've had is this bookending idea of making sure that all of our group activities have a sandwich style, right? So a predictable start and a predictable end. And that means that part of that transition piece has to be part of the end, right? So maybe that's a song, maybe it's a movement, maybe it's one of those long strings with the cute little flags that everybody holds on to. Maybe somebody has a buddy and everybody sticks with their buddy and they're in two by twos as they march down the hall. So that would be my first recommendation. My second one is when I was a preschool teacher way back in the day and had a lot of mixed neurological profiles in my room, I realized that what I was doing as a teacher really upregulated or downregulated my students. And so I would build my routines so that if we did a really exciting thing where everybody got silly and goofy, we would automatically downregulate together for a couple minutes before we would move on to something that required more structure and more control. And so this may be we dim the lights, we get into a soft movement and song, and everybody takes that as a cue that the neurology is going to kind of come down before we have to transition out of the room.
Great. Okay, we'll make this one our last question. It says, any magic words for helping to change the mindset of school teams, teachers, and paraprofessionals that are very compliance based and have a hard time wrapping their minds around co-regulation and engagement before communication?
Yes, I wish I had magic words. This is actually something I struggled a lot with at a recent consultation I did with a school district. And I think that the first thing, as with anything, it always comes down to the relationship in my experience. And it may take a long time for you as a provider to build relationships with people in these positions on your team, but it's where I would focus my energy. Emily Rubin, who is one of the creators of the SEEKS method, the SEEKS model, which I put in your resources, has a really beautiful way of talking about appreciative inquiry. It's a method that she encourages school districts to use as they're taking on new ways of thinking about learners on the spectrum and how to engage learners on the spectrum. The SEEKS model, by the way, is free. All of their resources are free on the website I provided, and she may have some more tips on how to have this conversation. But I think the first piece is really developing relationships by not only offering advice, offering listening. And from that listening, with that appreciation, inquiring about why these positions and mindsets are present and how they seem to fulfill or motivate the goals that this well-intentioned educator likely is feeling pressured by. So I'd love to talk a little bit more about it if we have more time in an email, but check out the SEEKS framework and see if you can find any of those resources helpful for chipping away at that.
Great. And how is SEEKS spelled, Tanna? Is that
It's SEE-KS.
okay?
It
Perfect.
stands for some long acronym of words, but it's a model of organizational change, if you will, that is intended for school districts and other organizations serving large groups of children on the spectrum, really using universal design and all of the wisdom of the CERTS model, which was developed by Emily, Amy, and Dr. Prezant, and kind of integrating them into this really usable and practical framework.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, I think we got through most of those questions. So thank you, Tanna, for sharing your knowledge with us today. If you would like to earn ASHA CEUs for today's session, please remember to complete the assessment. You can find the link to the assessment in the chat, or you will be redirected to the post-session page once this webinar ends. The link to the assessment will also be included in the follow-up email that will go out tomorrow at 1 p.m. The assessment must be completed at 80% or better, and it will remain open for 1 week. So thank you all for attending, and we hope you will join us for another Able You session very soon. So thank you again, Tanna.
Thanks so much, Blair. Thanks, everyone. I hope you have a great week.